In 1940, the world was on fire. The Battle of Britain was raging, a desperate day-by-day struggle for survival, and the British Purchasing Commission, led by the indefatigable Sir Henry Self, was scouring the United States, the great arsenal of democracy, with a blank check, desperate for any weapon that could fly and fight. Their standard fighter, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, was adequate, but it was already verging on obsolete. No match for the Luftwaffe's superb Messerschmitt Bf-109 at high altitudes. The British approached North American Aviation, NAA, a company known for building reliable trainers like the T-6 Texan, not high-performance fighters, with a simple proposal: please build us P-40s under license. The answer they received was one of the most audacious, arrogant, and consequential moments in military history. The president of NAA, James Dutch Kindleberger, a hard-charging, brilliant engineer, looked at the P-40's aging design and told the British, essentially, "That's a piece of junk. We're not interested in building a 10-year-old airplane. Give us 120 days and we will build you a better one, from scratch." This was madness. A modern fighter, from clean sheet design to flying prototype, took years, not months. The British, with the Luftwaffe at their throats, had no choice. They said yes. They funded the impossible project. This act of audacity was, itself, a rejection of the established order. But the real rejection came from NAA's own government. The United States Army Air Corps, USAAC, was furious. In their eyes, Kindleberger was a rogue, a traitor to the cause. All precious engineering talent, all industrial capacity, was to be focused on their chosen, approved projects: the revolutionary twin-engine P-38 Lightning and the massive brutish radial engine P-47 Thunderbolt. These were the official war-winning fighters. This NLAA project, this NA-73 as it was designated, was a distraction, a waste of resources on a foreign contract. The USAAC High Command, men like General Oliver P. Eccles, head of procurement, wanted nothing to do with it. They refused to fund it, refused to sanction it, and only begrudgingly gave it an experimental designation, XP-51, as a bookkeeping formality. The project was officially rejected by the very Air Force that would one day owe its survival to it. For the USAAC, the P-51 was a red-headed stepchild, a plane that, in their minds, would never be a frontline American fighter. This rejection, this utter lack of faith from their own government, had a profound, galvanizing effect on the NLAA design team. Led by the brilliant German-born engineer Edgar Schmude, who had once worked for Messerschmitt himself, the team at NGA became a skunk works before the term was even invented. They were a band of outcasts, working with a frantic messianic zeal, fueled by British money and pure spiteful pride. They were not just building a plane, they were building their argument, their vindication, in metal. They worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, sketching on chalkboards, running calculations, handcrafting parts, and they took a massive, world-changing gamble. Instead of a conventional wing, Schmude and his chief aerodynamicist, Ed Horkey, bet everything on a radical, theoretical new design from the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, the laminar flow airfoil. This was a wing designed not for the low-speed, turning dogfights of the past, but for one thing: speed. It was designed to maintain a smooth, laminar flow of air over a much greater percentage of its chord, dramatically reducing drag, especially at high speeds. The experts in the USAAC, the ones who had seen the data, were skeptical. They believed this radical wing would have vicious, uncontrollable stall characteristics, that it would be unstable, a death trap for the average pilot. Schmude ignored them. He was designing a thoroughbred, not a mule. In a miracle of production that is still studied today, the NA-73X prototype was rolled out of the factory in a staggering 102 days from the initial contract. It was beautiful, sleek, shark-like, its laminar flow wings sharp and thin, its revolutionary underbelly radiator scoop, itself a drag reduction marvel, giving it a clean, purposeful line. It was, in every visual sense, a winner. And when it flew, in October 1940, it was fast. It was shockingly fast, faster than the Spitfire at low and medium altitudes. The British were ecstatic. They named it the Mustang and rushed it into service, not as a fighter, but as a low-level tactical reconnaissance and ground attack plane. The Allison V-1710 engine, the same one used in the P-40, gave it incredible performance down low. But there, the magic ended. The moment the Mustang tried to climb, the moment it went above 15,000 feet, the altitude where the real war, the bomber escort war, was being fought, it died. The Allison engine, with its primitive, single-stage, single-speed supercharger, simply could not breathe in the thin, cold air. Its horsepower collapsed. It became, in the words of one test pilot, a dog, a slug, a brick. The USAAF, which had reluctantly acquired a few models for dive bombing, redesignating them the A-36 Apache, now had its final proof. The XP-51 was not a high-altitude thoroughbred. It was a low-level pony. The experts, the men like General Eccles who had championed the P-47 and P-38, were vindicated. The project was a failure. The rejection was now complete, total, and seemingly irreversible. The most advanced, most perfect airframe of the entire war was doomed, hobbled by the wrong engine, rejected by its own country, and dismissed as a failed experiment, while 8th Air Force bomber crews, flying deep into Germany in their self-defending B-17s, continued to be slaughtered in their hundreds by a Luftwaffe that owned the high-altitude sky. The failure of the XP-51 was a bitter, public, and catastrophic pill for North American aviation to swallow. In the halls of the USAAC at Wright Field, the "I told you so's" were deafening. General Oliver P. Eccles and his procurement staff, the high priests of the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning, felt utterly, completely vindicated. Kindleberger's 120-day wonder was exactly what they'd predicted. A flashy low-altitude hot rod for the British, but a complete non-starter for the real war, the high-altitude daylight bombing campaign that was, by 1943, becoming the bloody beating heart of the American war effort in Europe. The 8th Air Force, based in the damp, gray fields of England, was being bled white. The theory of the self-defending bomber formation, the B-17 Flying Fortress, was collapsing in the face of the Luftwaffe's relentless head-on attacks. The unescorted bombers were being torn apart over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, their crews suffering casualty rates higher than the infantry in the trenches of World War I. They were dying in their hundreds, falling from 25,000 feet in flaming, spinning coffins, all because they had no fighter that could go with them all the way to the target and back. The P-38s, brilliant in the Pacific, were plagued with engine problems and cockpit freezing issues in the frigid European high altitude. The P-47s, the juggernauts, were tough, rugged, and powerful, but they were short-legged. They were, as one pilot famously said, a brick that could barely turn, and they simply didn't have the range. They could take the bombers to the German border and then, in a heartbreaking, agonizing moment, they would have to waggle their wings, turn back, and leave their little friends to face the wolves alone. The crisis was absolute. The entire strategic bombing campaign, the linchpin of the Allied strategy, was on the verge of being called off. In the NDAA offices in Inglewood, California, Edgar Schmood and Dutch Kindleberger watched these reports with a sickening, profound sense of frustration. They had built the perfect plane. The laminar flow wing was a thoroughbred, a low-drag masterpiece. The airframe was sound, but it was shackled to an engine that belonged in a truck. The Allison V-1710 was a magnificent low-altitude engine, but its single-stage supercharger meant that above 15,000 feet it gasped for air, its horsepower collapsing, turning their high-speed Angel into a wallowing, useless dog. The British, who were using the Allison-powered Mustangs for low-level tactical reconnaissance and loving them for it, calling them the best planes we've ever had for the job, were the first to see the obvious. A test pilot at Rolls-Royce, Ronald Harker, flew one. He was astonished by its agility, its speed, its handling. "It's a rocket down here," he reported, "but take it upstairs, and it just gives up." He knew, with the instinctive knowledge of an engineer, what the problem was. He also knew that his company, Rolls-Royce, had just perfected the solution. The Merlin 60 series engine. The Merlin 60 was itself a masterpiece, a quantum leap in engine technology, thanks to its revolutionary two-stage, two-speed after-cooled supercharger. It was, in essence, a high-altitude breathing apparatus designed to force-feed the engine with compressed, cooled air, allowing it to maintain its full horsepower not just at 15,000 feet, but at 20,000, 30,000, even 40,000 feet. It was the engine that was making the new Spitfire Mark IX the undisputed king of the high-altitude dogfight. Harker scribbled a memo, a simple what-if thought experiment. The Mustang airframe is, in my opinion, the finest I have ever flown. With its current Allison engine, it is a failure above 15,000 feet. If you were to mount a Merlin 60 series engine in this airframe, you would have, in my opinion, the single best fighter aircraft in the world. That memo, a quiet, polite, British suggestion, lit a fire at North American. Schmood and Kindleberger seized on it. This was their lifeline. This was the answer. They knew the Packard Motor Car Company in Detroit had just begun license producing the Merlin as the V-1650 for American-built Spitfires and Lancaster bombers. The engine was available, or at least it existed on American soil. Schmood, his mind already racing, his team already sketching, went back to the USAAC, back to General Eccles, hat in hand, but this time with data. Sir, he must have argued, the project isn't a failure. The engine is. The airframe is a winner. The British agree. Let us, please, get 2 of the new Packard Merlins, and let us prove what this airframe can really do. The rejection was immediate. It was absolute. And it was furious. General Eccles, already embarrassed by the P-51's failure and the 8th Air Force's desperate situation, hit the roof. A British engine? He roared. In an American fighter? Are you insane, Schmood? The logistical nightmare, the spare parts, the maintenance training. We are building American fighters with American engines for an American war. The P-47 Thunderbolt, powered by a Pratt & Whitney, is our strategic escort solution. The P-38, powered by Allisons, is our solution. Your plane is a low-altitude novelty for the Royal Air Force. I am not diverting a single precious Packard Merlin engine which is earmarked for the British Lancaster program to your Frankenstein hybrid, your dead-end project. Your request is rejected. Do you understand me? Rejected. Again. Now get out of my office and go back to building trainers. You are done. This was the second rejection, the final rejection. The USAAC had not just disowned the Mustang, they had actively forbidden its evolution. For any other company, for any other engineer, this would have been the end. The project was dead. But Kindleberger and Schmood were not any other engineers. They were the men who had built a fighter in 100 days. They were furious. They had the answer to the 8th Air Force's slaughter, the answer that could win the air war. And a by-the-book general, blinded by made-in-America pride and his own doctrinal stubbornness, had just told them no. So, they went rogue. In one of the most audacious, insubordinate, and glorious acts of industrial defiance in history, Kindleberger and Schmood decided to do it anyway. They couldn't get an engine from the USAAC, so they bypassed them. They went back to the British, their original customer, and said, "Our Air Force says no, but if you could loan us just 2 of your new Merlin 60 series engines from your own allocation, we will, on our own time, with our own money, create the high-altitude fighter you are dreaming of." The British, desperate for such a plane, agreed instantly. Rolls-Royce, in a clandestine back-channel operation, air-freighted 2 brand-new Merlin 65 engines in crates marked automotive parts to the Entelilale factory in Inglewood. The project was black. It had no official funding, no official designation. Schmood pulled his best wing nuts, his most loyal engineers, off the main production line and put them in a walled-off, guarded corner of the factory. Their official job, engineering studies. Their real job, performing the most radical transplant in aviation history. And it was a nightmare. The Merlin was not a drop-in replacement. It was a British engine, built with British measurements. The entire engine bay had to be redesigned. The mounting points were different. The V angle of the cylinders was different. The crankshaft was higher. But the biggest problem, the one that made the engine so brilliant, was the supercharger. The Allison's supercharger was a small, compact, single-stage unit tucked neatly onto the back of the engine. The Merlin's was a monster. A massive, complex, two-stage, two-speed behemoth with its own intercooler and aftercooler, a Rube Goldberg contraption of gears and plumbing that was almost as big as the engine itself. It did not fit. The Mustang's sleek, beautiful, narrow cowling. It was impossible. Schmude and his team, working around the clock, sleeping on cots in the factory, did not modify the Mustang. They butchered it. They had to redesign the entire forward fuselage from the firewall forward. They had to lower the engine mounts, redesign the thrust line, and the cooling. The Merlin ran hotter, and the intercooler needed its own radiator. Schmude's original, brilliant, low-drag radiator scoop wasn't good enough, so they redesigned it. They made it deeper, more complex, a new masterpiece of aerodynamic duct design, all done in weeks, on the factory floor, with chalk and hand calculations. They were in a frantic race against time, not just to build it, but to build it before a USAAC inspector walked in, discovered their illegal, black project, and had them all arrested. Finally, in late 1942, after months of secret, Herculean labor, they rolled it out. The XP-51B, it was a mongrel, a hybrid, an unauthorized Frankenstein, and as NAAA's chief test pilot, Bob Chilton, strapped in, he looked at Schmude and he knew he was about to fly either a complete death trap or a war winner. He started the engine. It was a new sound, not the Allison's low growl, but the smooth, high-pitched, powerful roar of a Merlin. It was the sound of a revolution. The rejected project was about to get its second chance. The roar of the Rolls-Royce Merlin V 1650 engine was not the sound of an American-built Allison. It was a deeper, smoother, more refined symphony of power, a throaty, guttural roar that promised violence. Bob Chilton, NAA's chief test pilot, sat in the cockpit of the XP-51B, the Merlin Mustang, his hands moving over the controls with a practiced, methodical calm that betrayed nothing of the adrenaline coursing through his veins. This was not a test flight. It was an act of corporate treason. He was about to fly an aircraft that, according to the United States Army Air Corps, did not exist. It was an illegal, unauthorized, black project, a mongrel airframe built with a borrowed British engine in direct defiance of a two-star general's explicit orders. On the tarmac, standing well clear, was a small, tight, nervous knot of men. Edgar Schmude, the brilliant, haunted German designer, and Dutch Kindleberger, the bulldog president of NO. Their careers, their company, their entire futures were strapped into the pilot's seat with Chilton. If this Frankenstein so much as sputtered, if it failed, if it crashed, they were all finished, ruined. Chilton took a breath, the smell of high-octane fuel and new paint filling his lungs. Muroc Tower, this is NAA Experimental 51 Bravo. Requesting taxi to runway. For engine systems test. A small lie, in for a penny, in for a pound. Roger, 51 Bravo. The tower crackled back, oblivious. You are cleared to taxi. Chilton eased the throttle forward. The response was instant. The plane lunged. The Allison-powered P-51A had been quick. This was a beast. The torque from the new, four-bladed propeller was immense, pulling the plane to the left, forcing him to feed in right rudder, hard. He could feel the power, a living, breathing, angry thing, thrumming through the airframe. He lined up on the endless, dry lakebed runway of Muroc. He pushed the throttle to the firewall. The takeoff was not a takeoff. It was a launch. The Merlin engine's two-stage supercharger, even at low altitude, was already packing the cylinders with dense, compressed air. The plane accelerated with a savagery that pinned Chilton to his seat. The tail was up in 2 seconds. He was airborne, climbing steeply in less than 1,000 feet of runway. He pulled the gear up, the wheels thumping into their bays. He was at 5,000 feet before he even crossed the end of the runway. His first check, the fix. Schmood's team had not just crammed the Merlin in, they had redesigned the entire forward fuselage, including the massive ventral radiator scoop, to accommodate the Merlin's new, power-hungry intercooler. If their calculations were wrong, the engine would overheat in minutes. Chilton watched the gauges, his eyes darting. Oil pressure, green. Coolant temp, green. Intercooler temp, green. Everything. Perfect. Schmood's scoop wasn't just working, it was a masterpiece, channeling the air with an efficiency that was, in itself, a revolutionary act. "Okay, girl," Chilton whispered to the machine. "Let's see what the man in the book said you couldn't do." He pointed the sleek shark-like nose at the high blue desert sky, and he climbed. This was the test. This was the one, single, fatal flaw of the Allison Mustang, the 15 foot wall of death. He watched the altimeter needle wind upwards. 10 feet, 12 feet, 14 feet. In the old P-51A, this is where it would happen. The engine, starved of air, would begin to gasp. The power would fall off a cliff. The plane would become a wallowing, sluggish dog. He pushed past 15, €0. He was still climbing at 500 feet per minute. 16, €0. 17, €0. 18, €0. And then he felt it. A subtle mechanical thump from the engine behind him, a change in the pitch of the supercharger's whine, a sudden, new surge of power. The Merlin's second-stage supercharger gear had just automatically engaged. It was like being kicked in the back by a mule. The plane, which had just started to feel the thinner air, suddenly accelerated. It surged upwards, its climb rate increasing to 4,000 feet per minute. Chilton actually let out a short, sharp, involuntary laugh. It was the sound of a man witnessing a miracle. He was at 20,000 feet, an altitude where the P-47 Thunderbolt was just starting to get comfortable, and he was out-climbing it by 1,000 feet a minute. He pushed on. 25,000 feet, the domain of the FW-190. He was still climbing like a homesick angel. 30,000 feet. The air was thin, minus 40 degrees, the bomber's killing ground. The XP-51B wasn't gasping. It was thriving. It was a high-altitude monster. He finally leveled off at 30,000 feet, his hands tingling, his mind reeling. He looked out at the curvature of the earth, a place where his old Mustang could barely fly, and he felt the XP-51B, steady as a rock, hungry for more. "All right, Schmood," he breathed into his oxygen mask, "you built a climber. Now, let's see if you built a racer." He pushed the throttle quadrant forward, all the way to the firewall. War emergency power. The Merlin roared. A sound of pure, unadulterated fury. The plane leapt forward, and the airspeed needle began to climb with a speed that was simply impossible. 350 mph, 380, 400, 420. Chilton was staring at his instruments, his brain refusing to process the numbers. 430, 435, 440 miles per hour. He was in level flight at 30,000 feet, doing 440 miles per hour. This was not a plane. This was a rocket. A Spitfire 9, the Merlin's other home, topped out at 408 at a lower altitude. AP-47 Thunderbolt, in its prime, maybe hit 430. AP-38 was lucky to get 415. The feared Focke-Wulf 190, maybe 425 on a good day. This illegal, unauthorized, rejected hybrid was the fastest goddamn thing in the sky. Period. And it had the low-drag laminar flow wing to give it the one thing none of the others had. Range. It was the perfect plane. It was the war winner. It was the answer. Chilton didn't just fly straight. He had to know. He racked the plane into a hard 6G turn. The laminar flow wing, the one the experts at the USAC had feared would stall viciously, bit. It held the turn like it was on rails, the controls crisp, responsive. He threw it into a snap roll. It was a blur. He wasn't flying a fighter. He was wearing one. When he finally brought the XP-51B down, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely unstrap his helmet. He taxied back to the secret, walled-off hangar, his mind a complete, reeling blank, trying to process the paradigm shift he had just experienced. He cut the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. He climbed out of the cockpit, his legs weak. Schmood and Kindleberger were standing there, their faces ashen, pale, looking like men awaiting their own execution. They had heard the engine scream. They had seen the plane vanish. But they didn't know. Well, Kindleberger asked, his voice a dry, hoarse croak. Did she hold together? Chilton just stared at them, at these two men who had defied a government, who had risked everything on a hunch. He tore his oxygen mask off. Hold together? He said, his voice cracking with a wild, disbelieving laugh. Hold together? Dutch. Edgar, you haven't just built a new fighter. You just won the goddamn war. The elation at Ney was a nuclear detonation. They had the data. It was undeniable, irrefutable. It wasn't a theory. It was a fact. 440 miles at 30,000 feet. The answer to the 8th Air Force's slaughter, the key to winning the air war, was in their hands, and it was signed by Bob Chilton. They flew to Wright Field. They got the meeting with General Eccles, the man who had rejected them. This was it. The moment of vindication. They rolled out the charts. They presented the flight data. They laid the war-winning miracle at his feet and expecting. What? An apology? A parade? A massive contract? They got none of it. General Eccles sat at his desk, his face like a stone tablet, as Schmood and Kindleberger, their voices trembling with pride, laid out the numbers. He looked at the speed chart. He looked at the climb rate. He looked at the report. And when they were finished, he didn't speak for a full minute. He just stared at them. And his eyes, they weren't filled with joy. They weren't filled with relief. They were filled with a cold, hard, calculating fury. Gentlemen, Eccles said, his voice a low, dangerous hiss, let me be perfectly clear. What you have presented me with is not a miracle. It is a crime. Kindleberger's smile froze. Schmood went pale. You, a civilian contractor, went behind the back of the United States Army Air Corps, your primary customer. You defied a direct order from this office. You secretly and illegally procured strategic war materiel from an allied power, engines that were earmarked for their bomber production, endangering our diplomatic relations and our entire Lend-Lease agreement. And you used those engines to build a mongrel, a hybrid, an unauthorized, unvetted, logistical nightmare. He stood up, his hands on his desk, leaning in. I am not impressed, Mr. Kindleberger. I am appalled. Do you have any idea what you are proposing? We are in the middle of the largest industrial mobilization in human history. Our entire production line, our entire logistical pipeline to the European theater is built around two engines, the R-2800 for the P-47 and the Allison for the P-38. Our factories are tooled, our mechanics are trained, our parts depots are stocked. And you waltz in here and expect me to what? Stop all that? To throw that entire billion-dollar investment out the window? To retool every factory? To introduce a third engine type into the ETO? A British engine with British measurements, British tools, British spare parts? It's a fantasy. It's a logistical impossibility. It would be 6 months of chaos before we could even get this creature to the front line in any numbers. We don't have 6 months. But sir, Schmood pleaded, his voice strangled. The 8th Air Force is dying now. This plane, it can save them now. The 8th Air Force, Eccles snapped, will make do with the P-47. We are adding drop tanks. We are improving the engine. That is the solution. Your data is. Noted, Mr. Kindleberger. But it is irrelevant. The decision has been made. The P-51 is a low-altitude fighter bomber for the British. The P-47 is the high-altitude escort fighter for the United States Army Air Corps. That is final. He sat down. Your project is rejected. Again. And if I ever hear that you have flown that illegal hybrid again, I will personally see to it that North American aviation never builds so much as a rivet for this government again. You are dismissed. Schmood and Kindleberger stood there, frozen. They had done it. They had built the perfect plane. They had proven it. And the answer was still no. The rejection, this time, wasn't about aerodynamics. It was about pride, logistics, and a bureaucracy that was willing to sacrifice its own men rather than admit it was wrong. The scene in General Eccles's office was a final, brutal, soul-crushing defeat. Kindleberger and Schmood, the two men who had just built the single most important aircraft of the Second World War, walked out of that office not as heroes, but as chastened, humiliated criminals. The data was irrelevant. The 440 MEP speed was irrelevant. The truth was irrelevant. The project was dead, killed not by enemy action, not by physics, but by the one thing no engineer could ever defeat: bureaucratic inertia, logistical dogma, and the wounded pride of a powerful general. The XP-51B, the magnificent war-winning hybrid, was towed back to its secret walled-off hangar, its Merlin engine silenced. The order was explicit. It was not to be flown. It was not to be touched. It was to be forgotten. The rejection was absolute. Back in England, the 8th Air Force continued to die. The faucet of blood over Germany was turned on, full blast. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission in August 1943 cost them 60 B-17s, 600 men, in a single day. A second raid on Schweinfurt in October cost them 77 more. The losses were catastrophic, unsustainable. The bomber crews flying into that wall of flak and fighters called it Black Week, and they knew with a sickening certainty that the entire strategic air campaign was on the verge of collapse. General Ira Eaker, the 8th Air Force commander, was in a state of cold despair, his self-defending bombers being slaughtered, his short-legged P-47 and P-38 escorts useless for the deep strikes. He was failing, and he knew it. But a secret as powerful as the Merlin Mustang itself, cannot be contained. Bob Chilton, the test pilot, was a man who had touched the future. He had flown at 440 Mir at 30,000 feet. He had felt what that plane could do. He may have been ordered to stay quiet officially, but a pilot talks. And at the dusty, windswept, adrenaline-fueled Oasis Officers Club at Muroc, Chilton talked. He talked to other test pilots. He talked to the ferry pilots who were passing through, the men who were delivering new planes to the combat theaters. He didn't share the data, not the numbers. He just shared the feeling. "You think the Thunderbolt is hot?" he'd say, a quiet, dangerous grin on his face, swirling a glass of bad whiskey. "You think the Spitfire can turn? You haven't seen anything. I flew a plane last week, a Mustang, with a Merlin. And it's not a plane. It's a goddamn rocket ship. It's a 450-mile-an-hour miracle." The rumor. It was a spark. A single, electrifying rumor. A Merlin Mustang. A 450-mile-an-hour Mustang. It jumped from Muroc to right field to the ferry pilots, and it crossed the Atlantic. It landed as a whisper in the damp, freezing Nissen huts of the 8th Air Force in England, in the ears of the fighter pilots who were watching their bomber crews die every day. It reached the desperate, battle-weary commanders. Men like Colonel Don Blakesley, a hard-charging, aggressive fighter group commander, a man who despised the P-47 for its short range, a man who was screaming at Eaker for a plane that could fight. "I hear Ney has a hot rod, General," Blakesley must have said, a Mustang with a Merlin. The pilots from the States are raving about it. Why the hell don't we have it? This was the end around. The rumor, the pilots' gossip, had bypassed the entire procurement bureaucracy. It had bypassed the rejection. Eaker, now fighting for his very command, his entire strategy in flames, did the one thing Eccles never expected. He went over Eccles' head. He went straight to the top. He went to General Henry Hap Arnold, the Chief of the Army Air Forces, the architect of American air power. And his message was simple, brutal, and undeniable. Sir, the 8th Air Force is dying. We are losing the air war. The P-47 and P-38 cannot do the escort mission. I am being slaughtered. I understand, from unofficial reports, that North American has an experimental aircraft, a Mustang with a Packard Merlin engine, that can do 440 miles per hour and has the range to reach Berlin. The procurement division has rejected this aircraft on logistical grounds. Sir, with all due respect, to hell with logistics. My men are dying. I need that goddamn airplane, and I need it now. The effect was a nuclear detonation in the Pentagon. Hap Arnold, a man who cared about one thing and one thing only, winning, was apoplectic. He summoned General Eccles to his office. It was not a meeting. It was a reckoning. The story, as it is told, is that Arnold had Eaker's cable and Chilton's test data side by side, on his desk. Oliver, Arnold must have roared, "What is this? Eaker's telling me he's losing the war. And this report that you have apparently rejected, tells me that NAA has a plane that can win it. You rejected the war winner because of parts compatibility." The game was over. Eccles, the logistics man, the man who had been right about everything on paper, was wrong. He was catastrophically, historically wrong. His rejection was overruled, violently, by the Chief of Staff himself. Hap Arnold, in that one furious meeting, changed the course of the war. He picked up the phone. He called Dutch Kindleberger at NAA. "Dutch," he roared, "this is Arnold. About this Merlin Mustang of yours. Build them. Build all of them. I don't care how you do it. I don't care about the logistics. I don't care about the cost. I am giving you priority alpha, the highest rating in the country. You will have every engine, every propeller, every rivet you need. I want the first one rolling off the line, yesterday, and you will not stop until we have total air supremacy over Berlin." The rejection, the one that had been handed down 3 times, the one that had labeled the P-51 a failure, a dog, a logistical nightmare, a crime, was gone. It had evaporated. The red-headed stepchild of the USAAC, the rejected fighter jet project, though technically a propeller plane, its performance and engineering were of the jet age, had just been adopted. It had just become the savior of the United States Army Air Forces. Now, Schmood and Kindleberger, the men who had been traitors just a day before, were faced with the real impossible task, doing exactly what Eccles had said could not be done. They had to mass-produce a British-designed engine in America, retool their factories in the middle of a war, and build thousands of their Frankenstein hybrid, fast enough to save the 8th Air Force from annihilation. The rejection was over. The real war, the war of production, had just begun. Hap Arnold's phone call was not a request. It was an atomic bomb dropped directly into the center of the Army Air Corps procurement bureaucracy. The shockwaves hit General Oliver Eccles and his logistics-first proponents with the force of a physical blow. The game was over. The rules were rewritten overnight by a single, furious, results-driven general. The rejected project, the logistical nightmare, the mongrel hybrid, was, by order of the Chief of Staff, now the single highest priority production program in the United States. Dutch Kindleberger and Edgar Schmood returned to Inglewood, California, not as chastened criminals, but as anointed saviors, armed with the most powerful weapon in wartime. A Priority Alpha 1 directive. This meant North American aviation now had the power to, quite literally, steal whatever it needed from any other program. When they called Packard in Detroit and said, "We need every V1650 Merlin engine you can build," they weren't asking, they were telling. The production orders for British Lancaster bombers were sidelined. When they needed high-grade aluminum, the production quotas for P-38s and P-47s were squeezed. The logistical hell that Eccles had claimed made the project impossible was simply willed out of existence by Arnold's command. The NLAA factory in Inglewood became a controlled industrial hurricane. Schmood and his wingnuts were no longer a secret walled-off skunk works. They were the masters of the plant. Their illegal, hand-drawn schematics for the Merlin transplant, now the official, sacred blueprints for mass production. They had to retool everything, merging British, Merlin, and American, NLAA airframe, industrial philosophies on the fly, a process that should have taken years, but which they accomplished in months. They were men possessed, working around the clock, fueled by the knowledge that every minute they saved, every shortcut they took, would translate directly into American lives saved over Germany. The first production P-51Bs, the Merlin Mustangs, began rolling off the lines in the late summer of 1943, and by that winter they were arriving, crated and shrouded in secrecy, at the damp, frozen airfields of the 8th Air Force in England. They were assigned, fittingly, to a new unit, the 354th Fighter Group, the Pioneer Mustang Group. The pilots, men who had been raised on the brute force, radial engine roar of the P-47, looked at this new machine with suspicion. It was sleek, yes, almost delicate-looking. It had a liquid-cooled engine, a system notorious for being vulnerable to a single, lucky rifle bullet. It didn't look tough, but then they flew it. The reaction was not just positive, it was a religious conversion. It was a revelation. It climbed, not with the rumbling, brutish power of the Thunderbolt, but with the smooth, seemingly effortless vertical rush of a rocket. At 30,000 feet, where the P-47 was a sluggish, wallowing beast, the Mustang was just hitting its stride. The two-stage, two-speed supercharger kicked in with a satisfying thump, and the plane accelerated. And it turned. That radical, laminar flow wing, the one the experts had called unstable, bit into the thin, cold air, allowing the P-51 to turn inside a Spitfire, a feat that was considered aerodynamically impossible. But the most beautiful, most sacred part was the range. Schmood's low-drag airframe, combined with the Merlin's surprisingly efficient fuel consumption at altitude, and crucially, a new, massive 108-gallon internal fuel tank, and later 150-gallon drop tanks, gave it legs. It had the range to go all the way. It could go to Berlin. The operational test came in February 1944. The 8th Air Force, now under the command of the aggressive, hard-charging General Jimmy Doolittle, launched Operation Argument, known to history as Big Week. It was a massive, all-out assault on the German aircraft industry, a series of deep penetration raids into the heart of the Reich. And this time, the B-17s were not going alone. For the first time, as the massive bomber streams crossed the border into Germany, as the short-legged P-47s and P-38s waggled their wings and turned for home, a new group of fighters stayed with them. The P-51s. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them. The elite Jagdgeschwader units, the aces, the veterans, led by men like Adolf Galland, launching their FW-190s and BF-109s, expecting another easy, unescorted slaughter. What they found, instead, was a nightmare. They found a swarm of silver, shark-nosed killers at 30,000 feet that were faster than their 109s. They found a fighter that could outturn their 190s at high altitude. They found an enemy that could outclimb and outdive them both. The P-51, the rejected project, the dog, was not just as good as the German fighters. It was categorically superior. It outperformed the German Air Force in every single critical, high-altitude metric. The pilots of the 354th, men like Don Blakesley, who had famously demanded the plane, were unleashed. Doolittle's new, terrifying order was simple. Go hunting, find them, kill them. The Mustangs didn't just escort the bombers, they swept ahead, clearing the skies. diving on the German fighter formations before they could even form up. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe was devastating. The German aces, men who had been the undisputed masters of their own skies for 4 years, were suddenly, terrifyingly, outmatched. They were being hunted relentlessly from the moment they took off to the moment they landed. The P-51s, with their massive fuel loads, could loiter. They could escort the bombers to Berlin, see them safely home, and then spend another hour strafing German airfields, trains, and troop convoys on the way back. The faucet of blood for the 8th Air Force was turned off, almost overnight. Bomber losses plummeted. The self-defending B-17s were finally defended. The air war turned decisively in less than a month. The Luftwaffe, forced into a battle of attrition it could not win, against a fighter it could not beat, was shattered. Its back was broken. Its veteran pilots were wiped out. The rejected fighter project, the plane the USAC had tried to kill 3 times, had, in the skies over Berlin, achieved total, brutal, and absolute air supremacy. This victory, this domination of the German Air Force, was the critical, non-negotiable prerequisite for D-Day. Without the P-51, the Luftwaffe would have been waiting in force over the Normandy beaches on June 6th, and the invasion, the liberation of Europe, would have been a catastrophic, bloody failure. The plane that General Eccles had called a failure, a logistical nightmare, and a dead end, had, in the final analysis, become the single most decisive, most important, and most victorious fighter aircraft of the entire war. The rejected project hadn't just outperformed the German Air Force, it had annihilated it, and in doing so, had saved the world.